them was because, pardon?
Sorry about that. I hit the recording button and it always announces it now.
Okay, one of them was because had some my wife had to have a little medical procedure, nothing serious, and she's fine. And the other one, of course, was for Memorial Day. I knew everybody had different things going, so we're going to kind of pick back up where we left and kind of remind you that what I'm trying to do is obviously talk about ancient history. But more than that, what I'm going to try to do is talk about it in terms of the Bible, and particularly try to bring the historical aspects of the Bible into perspective. Now, this is not a theology class. It's not a biblical. I'm not a big biblical scholar. I'm a historian, and so I'm not going to try to get into the theology of the things. I'm going to try to primarily talk about history. Where there's archaeological evidence or historical evidence to support the Bible, I'm definitely going to bring that in. And, that's my goal. So with that said, let's start at the very beginning. And the very beginning, of course, was the beginning of civilization. And in this time, we're going to talk about a couple of groups of people, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. I always start out with artwork, and I told you this year this session I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to do a cartoon, and I like this one. It says God makes the snake, and he says, "Boy, these things are a cinch." I can remember playing with Play-Doh when I was a little kid or something like it, and we used to make snakes like that. And so anyway, that's a little bit of humor there. So now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east. In Eden, a river flowed from Eden and separated into four headwaters. The name of the first was Pishon, the second was the Gihon, the third is the Tigris, the fourth is Euphrates. Genesis 2:10 to 14. Now, we know where the Tigris and Euphrates River are. We don't know the Pishon and the Gihon. Now, there's something I really want you to pay attention to this verse, and a lot of people miss it. A lot of people miss it. Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden. A river flowed from Eden and separated into four headwaters. In other words, the Garden of Eden was located probably at the headwaters of these four rivers. And that's really something I want you to pay attention to, because we're going to talk about the possible location of the Garden of Eden. And there's been a really big change in philosophy about where that is. From what there used to be. Even when I was a young man studying history, I remember reading about where they thought the Garden of Eden was, and they've done a lot of change in that now. So, the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution was brought about by the wide-scale transition of human culture from the lifestyle of nomadic hunting and gathering to one of settlement and agriculture. What we're basically saying is, around 6,000 BC to 8,000 BC, almost everybody in the world was hunters and gatherers. They were nomads. They followed the herds, they followed the grain crops wherever they might be. And as a result, this was basically the land that we know today as the old biblical land was just a land of people that were nomads. Well, that all changed about 6,000 BC in something called the Neolithic Revolution. Historians say there's only been three major revolutions in world history. This is the first one, where we transitioned from hunters and gatherers to farmers. The second one was the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, where machines took over from man and began doing work for men. And of course, we're on the cusp of the third great revolution in world history, and that's the technology revolution. And I'm telling you, it's going very, very rapidly. I can remember when I retired about 2000, a little bit before that, I was talking to my librarian, and I was pretty up on computers, and she said, "Well, have you got into the internet yet?" And I said, "What's the internet?" Now, that is amazing today to even think about that, folks. That was only 21 years ago. And I was not illiterate in computers. I was pretty good with computers. And I didn't know what the internet was. That's only been 21 years. I cannot imagine what's going to happen in the next 21 years. The earliest evidence of this Neolithic revolution occurred in what we call the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the present-day country of Iraq. It stretched westward and then south along the coast of what we call the Levant. The Levant is a name that is given to Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Israel today. And that formed what became known as the Fertile Crescent. And I'll show you a map of all this in a few minutes. The first plants selectively bred and harvested were wheat, emmer, and einkorn, that's wheat, barley, rye, flax, peas, bitter vetch, lentils, beans, and the first animals probably domesticated were dogs, sheep, goats, cows, and pigs. So men began to grow these crops and to raise these animals, pen them in, and domesticated them. And this was the Neolithic Revolution. Happened about 6,000 years ago. This revolution eventually led to the formation of civilization. And civilization kind of occurred simultaneously along 4 great river valleys in the world. And one of them is the Tigris-Euphrates, the other one is the Nile in Egypt, the Indus in India, and the Yangtze River Valley in China. We're not going to talk about the Indus and the Yangtze River valleys because that's out of our purview of the Bible and it's out of my ability to talk sensibly about it. So we're not going to talk about that. Now, what makes up a civilization? There's 5 things that have to be here in order for a civilization to exist. Number 1, you got to have towns, villages, cities. People begin to settle down. There's a little bit of a dispute about what the longest continually inhabited city in the world is, but most historians agree it was probably Jericho. They think people have been living together in groups around this city of Jericho today since about anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 BC. Damascus isn't far behind, but these 2 cities are probably 2 of the oldest cities in the world, if not the oldest cities in the world. Another characteristic of civilizations are large monuments. We're all familiar with the pyramids and those kind of things, but those aren't the oldest. The oldest monuments in existence, freestanding monuments, are something called the megaliths of Malta on the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. And this is the megaliths of Malta. We know nothing about them. We just know they're there and we know that they're ancient and we know that they're older than the pyramids. Other than that, we don't know what they were or who built them. There has to be a system of communication, writing. The oldest writing in the world came from the Sumerians, which we're going to talk about, and it's called cuneiform, and looks like chicken tracks. And they wrote on clay tablets and they baked them. The result is we've got a lot of them because they withstood erosion and all. They were also breakable, so that kind of hindered it. But we've got a lot of it. It took us a long time to translate cuneiform. We'll talk about that. You also have to have government and infrastructure. This is the ziggurat of Ur. This is the earliest pyramid that we know of. It's located in the town of Ur at the Persian Gulf area of Iraq. Ur, of course, is the city where Abraham came from. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the day. Finally, you have to have a division of labor and class structure. You begin to see people into groups. For instance, you might have a king, you might have high priests and nobles, and then after that, you might have merchants and scholars and other priests. Of course, you finally have the peasant farmers. And at the very lowest, you'd have the slaves, or that those were kidnapped or captured during the war. So these are the 5 characteristics that have to occur before you have a civilization. That first civilization occurred in the Fertile Crescent in the area that we sometimes call Mesopotamia. It's called Shinar in the Bible. In the Bible, if you read and you see the word Shinar, Shinar, they're talking about Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is present-day Iraq. So much, all the Old Testament, not much, all the Old Testament is set in the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, down around the Mediterranean coast of the Levant and over into Egypt. That's the place that the Old Testament is set. So Mesopotamia, as I said, was known as the Fertile Crescent. It stretched from the Tigris-Euphrates River north into Syria, westward in the Mediterranean coast, and then down what we know as Levant, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, the Nile River Valley of Egypt. And I'll show you a picture of this, a map of this in a second. Now, Mesopotamia today, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, is a lot different place than what it was 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, the upper river valley, in the upper part of the Mesopotamian River Valley, and again, I'll show you a map which will show you all this, an area we know now as Akkad. Akkad was much more fertile, cooler, and wetter than it is now. Today, it's pretty dry, it's pretty arid, and it's pretty hot. The lower Mesopotamian River Valley became known as Sumer. Sumer did not extend at that time into the Persian Gulf like it does now. The Persian Gulf was a lot further up and had inundated some of the delta area of Sumer. But now the land has basically taken over part of the Persian Gulf, and there's a lot more land exposed today in Sumer. And again, it's a lot different than it was. Today, it's very dry. It's almost desert. Back in these days, it was swamps and wetlands. Some things haven't changed. There have never been natural resources in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, Mesopotamia. It's always lacked natural resources. There's not very much wood, there's not very much stone, there's no ores. These all had to be brought in from other cultures. And finally, because there was a lack of natural resources and it was such a flat land, there were no natural defenses. And the result was that what you're going to see is over a period of about 3,000 years during the time of the Old Testament, the Fertile Crescent, and particularly Mesopotamia, was just a land of constant warfare. The result was you have a huge transitioning of peoples in and out, bringing with them different languages and cultures and traits. And, it constantly changes. Some people call it the mixing bowl. I call it fiery cauldron because it's so warlike in this period. And so, there's just so much changing going on. It's kind of hard to keep track of it all, I'll be honest. All that resulted in something called cultural diffusion, a process where an existing culture adopts the traits of another culture. And you see a lot of this going on. So the Sumerian culture basically was adopted by the Akkadians. The Akkadians were adopted by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were adopted by the Hittites. And it all got messed up. So here is the Fertile Crescent. Here is the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. This is the Tigris here. This is the Euphrates here. And this is the Persian Gulf. It used to be that the Persian Gulf came a lot more further up here than what it does now. Then the Fertile Crescent swung around Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Israel over into Egypt and along the Nile River Valley. You can see it forms kind of a crescent. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. This is the birthplace of civilization. And this is the land that is where the Old Testament is set, in this area here. Now, as I've said, Up until about 4,000 years ago, the Mesopotamian River Valley, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, was occupied by hunters and gatherers and cattle herders, nomads, probably of Semitic origin. That is, they came from the area south, in the area around the Arabian Peninsula and in Egypt and Africa and some of this areas. There were no villages, there were no roads, there were no waterways. There's nothing that existed that we would think of in terms of being a civilized society. But about 3,300 BC, the Sumerians came down from the Black Sea region. And again, I'll show you a map. I'll show you where that's at. And they began to come into this area. By the way, they didn't call themselves Sumerians. They called themselves Sangiga, blackheads. Terrible name for a group of people, but that's what they called themselves. When it's translated, it translates into blackheads. The Sumerians began to establish small villages, farm the land. That in turn provided more efficient hunting, proved much more efficient hunting gathering. Also meant that the villages could support different groups of people. And over time, these villages became towns. And then the Sumerians began to just, it seemed like it all just happened really, really fast. It seemed like the Sumerians all of a sudden just created a whole bunch of technology for its time. It's kind of like what's happening right now in the technology revolution that's going on in this world today. It seems like you can't keep up with it. Well, it's the same way that happened with the Sumerians, 3 to 4,000 BC. They just, all of a sudden, things just blossomed, and nobody knows why. Nobody knows why the Sumerians were the ones that came up with this. But look at some of the things they came up with. They come up with the first writing. They came up with the first irrigation canal systems to irrigate the land. They developed a wheel. You know, Egypt, for all of its wonders, they didn't develop the wheel until it was brought into them in the 1800 BC, 1700 BC by the group of people called the Hyksos. So the wheel was in Sumeria a long time before it was Egypt. They began to smelt ores and learned how to make bronze. They developed a math system based on 60. You know, think about it. The watch is 60 minutes. There's 60 degrees, things like this. This was the number system and is still the basis of some of our mathematical systems in the world today. They also begin to map the star constellations. Again, nobody knows why it happened so rapidly or why the Sumerians were the ones that did it. All we know is it just really happened fast. The result was that they really began to develop this technology rapidly. By the way, this is the man up here on the ladder. This is a very old photograph taken of Sir Henry Rawlinson. He is tracing some writing on what's called the Rock of Behistun. And the Rock of Behistun is where we were able to decipher the old Sumerian language of cuneiform. This was in the 1800s. And he had to go there and he had to trace this and then bring it back. And he worked for years to learn how to decipher cuneiform to where we could read it. Once it opened up a whole world to us about knowledge of the Mesopotamian River Valley. Before that, we didn't know really a whole lot about it. The rise of the city-state. Now, unlike the Nile Valley, which we're going to talk about in a lot later, the floods in the Tigris-Euphrates River valleys were extremely unpredictable and destructive. You never knew when the floods were going to come in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And when they did come, they came really bad. They were life-giving, but they also were very destructive. The Nile River Valley, you could set your watch by the floods. Literally, they developed the first calendar based on the floods of the Nile River. So, in order to protect themselves from these floods, the Sumerians began to build cities on hilltops. And these cities and the surrounding area became known as city-states. And there were several of these city-states in the lower Sumerian area, the lower Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. Each one had a priest king. Each one had a central temple where they worshiped their gods, and these almost universally became known as ziggurats. They were the earliest pyramids, and they kind of were an attempt to build up towards the heavens, But the city-state is the earliest form of government. Some people think that Eridu, down in the southern part of Sumeria, has been suggested as the original Garden of Eden. I don't know that I go along with that anymore. Remember I told you to pay attention when I told you about the headwaters of the Gihon and the Pishon and the Tigris and Euphrates? That to me indicates that the Garden of Eden was much further north than at the Persian Gulf region, where a lot of people have always traditionally placed it. In fact, I'm not even for sure it's there. I'll kind of talk to you about this here in a little bit. Other important Sumerian city-states besides Eridu were where Abraham came from, Lagash, Nippur, Kish. These are just some of the different city-states. And this is the ziggurat of It has been reconstructed. By the early 1800s, it was kind of in disrepair. And Saddam Hussein, of all people, actually reconstructed the ziggurat of By the way, he also placed an anti-aircraft gun on top of it when we were fighting him back in the early 2000s. I think he suspected that we would not bomb it. And so we placed an anti-aircraft gun up there to try to shoot planes down as they crossed over it. Didn't help, but he tried. So the Sumerians, of course, also developed a religion. And like almost every ancient religion, their religion was polytheistic. They had many gods, a lot of gods. They also were animistic. They worshiped natural phenomena and inanimate objects, and animate objects also, but primarily things like lightning and thunder and the storms and things like this. They also thought that their gods were anthropomorphic. That's a big long word, which means their gods took the form of humans or animals. And you're going to see this throughout ancient history, with the exception of the Hebrews, which was monotheistic and did not believe that their God, was human or an animal, and they didn't believe he was, lightning or any of that, and they surely had no other gods. But most of the other religions, in fact, all the other religions of the ancient world were polytheistic, animistic, and anthropomorphic, not the Hebrews and subsequently the Christians. The Sumerian religion heavily influenced the religious beliefs of later Mesopotamian cultures. You're going to find the elements of the Sumerian religion in the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, even a little bit into the Hebrew religion, but not much. There's a little bit there, but not much. Many of the Sumerian gods were those adopted later by other ancient civilizations. Enlil was the god of storms, and you see him everywhere. In the biblical times, he's often referred to as Baal. And I know if you read the Bible, you know about the Baals. And then, of course, there was Ishtar, the god of fertility and war and sex. And again, if you read the Bible, you know about the Astarte, the Asher poles and all this. So Ishtar and Enlil are found quite commonly with a little bit alteration of their names in other religions. You also have the first earliest literature, the Gilgamesh epic, which depicted the heroic events of a Sumerian warlord in his quest for knowledge. And just like almost every other ancient civilization, the Sumerians had their flood story depicted in the Gilgamesh epic. By the way, the Gilgamesh epic was written about 3000 BC, which is the earliest known writing that we know of, at least of a story. It predates the Old Testament. That doesn't mean the Old Testament is later than the Gilgamesh epic. That means the writing of it down was later. The Old Testament was an oral, it was passed down orally. And the Gilgamesh epic exactly predates the writing of the Old Testament. By the way, Pastor Prashant and I have talked about this a lot. It's very possible that the earliest written book of the Bible is the book of Job. I don't know if you know that, but the book of Job is extremely old. So here's a inscription, a carving on a rock of Gilgamesh slaying the sacred bull in his quest for eternal life. And this heroic story talks all about this. One of the things it talks about is the flood. Now, for a long time, historians said the flood was just nothing. They said it was just another flood. We know better, okay? Not only because the Bible tells us it wasn't just another flood, we also know better because of the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence that we have now of the flood. So let me tell you a little bit about this. 1922, British archaeologist by the name of Leonard Woolley was excavating the old Sumerian city of Ur, where Abraham came from. He found a whole lot of artifacts. He found something, found a sacred bull. He found a bull-headed lyre. He found a pair of figurines that he nicknamed the ram in the thicket. You might think about that in terms of Abraham and the story of Isaac, where he was going to sacrifice his son, and then he changed his mind when God told him no, not to do that, and that he provided the ram that was caught in the thicket. And these figurines show a ram caught in the thicket, and they were carved somewhere around 2500 BC. They also found a tomb of a Sumerian queen. But more importantly than that, he found evidence of a cataclysmic flood which dated about 2500 BC. And later excavations showed that this flood extended throughout the whole Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And this wasn't just any flood, folks. This was a really serious flood that basically tore everything up. I mean, it was widespread, it was deep, it was extremely destructive. And some people have said that this was the biblical flood. Now, there's a newer theory, okay? Back in the 1980s, two geologists from Columbia University by the name of William Ryan and Walter Pittman expounded a new theory about the flood. Now, folks, these are geologists from a very liberal university. These guys are not, these guys did not come from a biblical university or Bible university or anything like that. These are liberals. And these guys, I'm sure, were probably not, Christians. At least if they were, they probably had a lot of doubts about it. So for them to come up with a theory that supported the biblical theory of the flood, to me, is very important. And here's what they said. They said about 8 to 6,000 BC, the glaciers begin to melt really, really bad that at the last ice age. And we know this for a fact. During the last ice age, the glaciers begin to melt around anywhere from 10 to 6,000 BC. The Mediterranean Sea, as a result, like all the other waters of the world, begin to rise. And the Mediterranean Sea began to really get a lot higher and inundating land. Eventually, all this vast water that had risen in the Mediterranean Sea, it's kind of like a bathtub. It had nowhere to go. And they said it popped the plug at the Bosporus Straits. Now, I'm going to show you where that is. But at this time, the continents of Europe and Asia were joined together by the isthmus of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. And they said that eventually the water became so strong that it just absolutely just blew out this isthmus. And when it did, it produced a cataclysmic flood over the area that we now know as Armenia and Georgia and into the Tigris-Euphrates River around 5000 BC. and they said this was just no ordinary flood. They said that the amount of water that would have been created by this flood would have created a waterfall 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. I've been to Niagara Falls, folks, and the thing that impressed me about Niagara Falls was the immense power. I can't even imagine something 200 times more powerful than Niagara Falls. It said it produced enough water in one day to cover Manhattan to a depth of at least 2 times the height of the Empire State Building. Can you imagine the amount of water that flooded into the Black Sea? Well, the Black Sea, all that water in the Black Sea had to go somewhere. So here's what I'm talking about. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Sea of Marmara. This is the Dardanelles. The Sea of Bosporus, the Bosporus Straits now separate this. This is a satellite photo and you really can't see it, but there's a strait of water there where the Black Sea up here is connected with the Mediterranean Sea. This is all controlled by Russia. Now, the Black Sea is a Russian area. You'll notice that the Black Sea, you've got really dark areas up here. That's the deep part of the Black Sea. We have done work down into the seabed of the Black Sea. That seabed contains freshwater fossils. The lighter area up here, this area up around here, this all contains saltwater fossils. So this means that all this area probably was not underwater and the Mediterranean Sea burst into here and flooded all this. All that water had to go somewhere else. Where it went was here. This is Georgia, and this is Armenia down in this area. Guess what's all found down in here? The headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Pishon, and the Gihon River, at least what we think might be them. A lot of biblical scholars are beginning to wonder if indeed this was not the Garden of Eden. Up here on the Black Sea, the steppes, this is a real rich agricultural land. And indeed, the Garden of Eden may have been in this area right through here that's underwater now. We don't know. Traditionally, it's been placed down here. Some people have placed it up here, but there's a new thought that it might be in this real fertile area of the Georgian steppes here. The problem is, again, this is all controlled by Russia, and they're not going to let anybody do anything, as far as excavation or anything. So this is the Sumerians. I had hoped that I would be able to get into the Akkadians, and I will just a little bit here. But I'm going to have to continue on with this next week, and we'll do that as much as we can. I'm trying to catch up from my 2 weeks that I've been gone, so I don't get too far different from what I'm doing here at the township where I'm based. So about 2,900 to about 2,300, all these city-states that I just told you about, and Nippur and Lagash and all these other Sumerian city-states, they all got into a war, a civil war. And they really became weakened as a result of that. The result was that there was a group of people known as the Akkadians in the northern part of the Mesopotamian River Valley. And they were just kind of sitting around letting the Sumerians fight their way into basically submission. And it finally got to the point where the Sumerians had hurt each other so bad and had weakened each other that the Akkadians came down and took control of Sumer. So you have the first transition of a civilization, of a culture going on, this cultural diffusion that I talked about. And the Akkadians became the ruling group of people in the Mesopotamian River Valley now, as opposed to the Sumerians. Mainly because they had a new ruler. He is generally called the first real ruler of the world. His name was Sargon. He later on called himself Sargon the Great, which, by the way, that was not his name. Sargon was a title, which meant the legitimate one. He became a real bold military leader, and he brought all the Sumerian states under his control, established a new capital at Akkad, and that's where the name of the Akkadian civilization came from. It was on the Tigris River. We don't know exactly where Akkad was. We've never found it. Most people think it's in the area around Baghdad, particularly the southwestern suburbs. If you know anything about Baghdad, because of the Iraqi war, you know that that's the area of the Shiite militiamen, and they're surely not going to let anybody come in there and excavate their city to try to find evidence that would support the Bible. That's the last thing they would do. He soon conquered the rest of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley and expanded his empire into present-day Turkey, Syria, and the Persian Gulf. He became the first emperor of the world. And to them, that was the world, folks. They didn't know anything else existed outside of this. And he and his son, Naram-Sin, they were the great empire of the ancient world in the beginning. Sumeria was just a bunch of city-states. They did a whole bunch of really important things and made a whole bunch of really important things, but they never had political control. The Akkadians came in and got all this under one ruler, Sargon and his son Naram-Sin. And this is a bronze of Sargon the Great that we found from ancient history. And this is the Akkadian Empire. So the Akkadian Empire stretched here along the Euphrates River Valley and the Tigris River Valley, and around the Persian Gulf area. So it was the first empire in world history. Now, the first Akkadian that's mentioned in the Bible was a man by the name of Nimrod. Again, you probably heard of Nimrod. What does the Bible say about Nimrod? Hang on here, let me move this. It said Nimrod was one of the first Akkadians mentioned in the Bible. Nimrod, whose kingdom included Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Kelna in Shinar. And this is in the 10th chapter of Genesis. Also in the 10th chapter of Genesis, Nimrod is described as the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham, the great-grandson of Noah. And he's described as a mighty warrior on the earth and a mighty hunter. And the Bible also in Micah 5:6 describes Mesopotamia as the land of Nimrod. So Nimrod was an Akkadian, and the Bible mentions him. We don't know a whole lot about Nimrod. Some people think that Nimrod was the name of Sargon the Great. We don't know that. That's supposition. Josephus, the great Jewish historian that wrote around the time of Jesus and wrote about Jesus, he wrote a history of the Jewish people. And he said that Nimrod was the one that built the Tower of Babel in the land of Shinar. And of course, you know the story of the Tower of Babel, where the people built this big temple that tried to reach the heavens, and God became concerned because he said they were learning too much. So he tore it down and confused the languages. And some people say that Nimrod was the man that led the development of this Tower of Babel. No one knows for sure. By the way, we don't have any historical evidence of the Tower of Babel. Many biblical historians feel it was destroyed by a group of barbarians known as the Gutians. And these Gutians came down into lower Mesopotamia during the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and probably destroyed the Tower of Babel because they destroyed a whole lot of other things at the time. So here is an engraving in a sculpture of Nimrod slewing a lion. We know this. We don't know exactly who Nimrod was. He's mentioned in the Old Testament, but we don't know who he was. So I'm going to stop here because it's about 3:15 and I don't want to hold you any longer, but I hope that you see that what we're going to be doing is trying to place the Bible in historical context of ancient history. So next week, we're going to finish this up. It won't take long, and then we're going to begin a discussion of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are all over the Old Testament. I mean, they are everywhere in the Old Testament. And we know a whole lot about the Assyrians now. And some of it comes from the Bible and some of it comes from extant sources. So with that, I'm going to let you go. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. And I'll turn it back over to Kayla.
All right. Thank you, Tony.